Essentially, Sold a Story is about an idea about reading that isn't right, that has taken hold in American schools.
It seems that you started telling this story to a broader, more public audience in 2018 with Hard Words and continued with Sold a Story that recently came out. Did the pandemic reignite the story, or what unanswered questions or data pushed you to re-engage with the story that ultimately became the podcast Sold a Story?
Well, yeah, the answer to that is kind of a long story. I'll try to tell you it briefly. I got interested in this topic like 5 years ago now, actually before Hard Words. And you're right that Hard Words, which was an audio documentary podcast episode and an article that came out in 2018, I think that is the piece that a lot of people point to as the one that they first discovered that I did. But actually, the year before that, in 2017, I did a piece that was specifically about kids with dyslexia and why they have a hard time getting the help they need in school. And I've been an education reporter for a long time, and I work on these long form projects. I do 2 or 3 of them a year. And I had no idea that I would still be on this topic 5 years later. But that just opened up this huge topic that I didn't know anything about, and that I quickly recognized was a really big issue and problem. So Hard Words was really the piece that I did out of the dyslexia piece, which asked the large, because what was very clear to me after doing this piece about what kids with dyslexia need is that lots of kids aren't being taught how to read in school. And the kids with dyslexia are having the most problem with that. They're sort of the biggest casualties when core instruction is not teaching kids what they need to know about written English. But lots of kids are struggling. And dyslexia itself, as Tiffany can tell us, is on a continuum, right? Some people have very severe dyslexia, some people much milder. And whether you quote unquote have dyslexia or not is some sort of decision someone makes along that continuum, right? But what we know is that none of us are born with brains they're wired to read. Some of us don't have a problem learning. It's really easy, and we don't even need much instruction in some cases. But it turns out that a lot of us, in fact, maybe even most of us, most kids, really do need good instruction. They really depend on it. So Hard Words was the first foray into sort of looking at core instruction, and I think that caught a lot of people's attention. It caught the attention of parents whose kids are struggling a little bit or a lot, and was like, oh yeah, I'm not the only one. There are a lot of parents out there who think they're the only one. It caught the attention of teachers, and it caught some teachers and others in a sort of an alarming way, like you were talking about yourself. Oh, really? I'm not teaching kids what they need to know. And many people bristled at that and were defensive, and some people still are. But I've watched over the years individuals in my email inbox and on Twitter change their mind about this and say, oh, I think you're right. There's some stuff I didn't know about how kids learn to read and what I need to teach them to make sure that all kids can do as well as we want them to do. And I did a series of other programs through there and through the pandemic. So I wouldn't say the pandemic itself actually was a tipping point in terms of making Sold a Story. In fact, we were already sort of beginning to make that podcast. And I can talk a little bit about the pandemic, but essentially Hard Words and the reporting before and after that, I just kept coming back to the question of sort of why and how. Why and how did it happen that we, broadly speaking, the human beings have known actually for about 50 years or so. There's been this big body of evidence accumulating on reading and how it works, how our brains do it, what we need to learn, why some people have a hard time learning it, what that means, the implications of all that. There's this big body of research on that. And it was just very clear that many people in schools didn't know it. Many parents didn't know it. Many people in general didn't know it. And, so Sold a Story was really answering the question, why? Why, if researchers and others have known this for so long, why do people in schools not know it or not know it in a way that is really helping them teach kids better how to read? So Sold a Story was well underway when the pandemic came along, but I would say that the pandemic actually shifted the reporting a little bit in a few different ways. One, suddenly I couldn't leave my house and go places, and what I'm used to doing as a reporter is getting on an airplane, getting on a train, getting in my car, visiting people, visiting classrooms, and I couldn't do that. So I had to do it all like this, remotely, which was an interesting challenge. But in fact, it was because Sold a Story actually had so much history that had to be told. It wasn't as much of an impediment as I originally thought. I was really in a panic at first, thinking we're not going to be able to do this. And then I realized that what I really needed for that was to talk to a lot of people and to go into archives, to dig into the history, to look at documents, to find old video and audio, to try to understand how an idea, essentially Sold a Story is about an idea about reading that isn't right, that has taken hold in American schools and has implications for how kids are being taught. The other thing I'll say about the pandemic, one other thing about the pandemic, I think one of the things I started to notice in my early interviews was that the pandemic was revealing this problem to many parents. So parents were sitting and were basically guests in the first grade classroom all of a sudden. So when you're a parent and you send your kid off to school, essentially you say goodbye and they go into the classroom and the door closes and you don't know very much about what happens in there. I mean, maybe you get invited in and you volunteer. And as school goes on, for those of us who are parents, it gets more and more a closed box, right? As they get older and older, and you send them off and you just assume and trust that they're being taught the things they need to know. And a whole lot of parents all over the world were suddenly in their kids' classrooms with them, and they were seeing how kids were being taught to read. And there were a number of parents I was finding in the course of my interviews and phone calls who were looking at that instruction and saying, what is this? Why are they being taught this way? What's going on?